Um, yeah, so as I said, I'm happy to be here. I realize this is on the third day of your meeting, and you've had like already some days of interesting interactions, understanding spirituality. Um, yeah, if there are particular questions about spirituality in relation to sacred sites, please, I'd very much welcome them because I really think that discussion on this is will be really important. I have my own approach to how I worked with this, which I will talk about, but I'm very keen to explore more. So those questions, particularly, please don't hesitate to ask in the end. Okay. Yes. Currently, I work in the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group at Wageningen University as an assistant professor. The work on sacred natural sites is something that I've carried from practice into the university. The books I've written on this, they're a bit of a testimony to the work of many hands and minds, edited volumes with examples from all over the world, mostly, that usually led to some practical conservation guidance that I will talk about. And then I'll go a little bit more in depth on how I theorized some of this work. So we'll first look a little bit at how conservation can be led by the values that we all hold and how these values form paradigms for movement. We'll then look more closely into sacred natural sites in the context of nature conservation, to whom these places are sacred and what that means. We'll then discuss a little bit about juristic personhood and spirited sites, because I feel that in my own research, I haven't been able to dig deep enough into this new idea, which is probably not so new, but we'll talk about that. That nature has rights and what that means for sacred places. Yeah, so the implications for the conservation, management, and governance will be discussed towards the end a little bit more to just land on that practical note. Yeah, starting out on how conservation is led by the values that we hold. And this is maybe for people coming from maybe have more a heuristic background in philosophy, a very simple way of looking at values. But in the realm of conservation, values have only come into play as serious things to be considered in management or governance over the past 30 years, I would say. And we have these different value paradigms where, like in looking at intrinsic values, for example, this is probably at the birth of the conservation movement. People wanted to protect nature for itself. This is the idea that nature in itself is worthwhile protecting, and because it doesn't have a voice, we should protect this. Later on during the 90s, up into the 2000, maybe 2010s or so, the instrumental values of nature became more important. We had a whole upcoming ecosystem services. I would almost call it a hype. It's been an interesting development that's supported policy development across Europe, and I would say is still a big theme in terms of looking at the value of nature and offers opportunities for conservation. But it's really is built on this idea that nature is there for people to serve us. Maybe a little bit like the Christian idea of, okay, we are the stewards of nature. But at the same time, we do this because we are the ones that take these decisions about what happens with nature, because it services us, or serves us. Maybe a more Christian terminology to put there. Yeah, looking then at the more recent value paradigm, relational values, we're looking at the value of the relationship that we have with nature, how we relate to nature. And in this paradigm, we find ideas about biocultural diversity that try and bridge this gap that we have in our Western philosophy, that we are somehow different from nature, and that culture is something that is close to us, nature something that is out there, and that they're not the same. But at the same time, relational values build on the relationship that we have with nature. And so the paradigm there is more nature with people. So we see a shift in these values from nature for itself to nature for people to nature with people. And and this is an interesting development in itself. I've now been around in conservation circles for some 30 years, and I can see that I can now say that I've probably, came in towards the end of the intrinsic values paradigm. I lived through the instrumental values age, and I'm now in the relational values sphere. And it feels a lot better for the work I do to be work operating in a relational values paradigm. It fits me well, and I can see that the work on sacred natural sites, on spiritual values in relation to nature, for various reasons, just fits better in conservation than it had before. For me, in my research, and I already put in a spoiler, I'm going to throw in a little bit more theory. I'd like to present the work I do using this iceberg analogy. Perhaps it's not very original, but it really serves purpose. So, in my experience, the conservation programs that we see happening on the ground, their governance and management, are really the top of the iceberg. And when we go a little bit deeper, we notice that, hey, there are different knowledges that help us build this conservation practice. And there are different rights. This is that policy context in the talk of today. But when we go a little bit deeper, we find that these knowledge systems and rights and these programs are actually built on how we see the world, how we relate to the world. So our cultures, our religions. And if we go even deeper, we can basically come back to the idea of values again that that underpin much of the worldviews and cultures in the world. And to me, that is where the religious, the spiritual, and the sacred are anchored in these values. So we're used to looking at this part, probably currently, but what about the deeper values, the worldviews, the cultures, and how they affect conservation of sacred natural sites? To people who are practitioners, who do traditional ceremony, who have their own sacred places, it will be obvious that these values are important. But to managers in conservation or decision makers, it doesn't come so natural quite often. And this is a space where you have to build bridges. So let's go on a little tour together and explore a few sacred places from around the world and what is so interesting about these places in terms of their value for biodiversity conservation or nature conservation. Okay, here we're landed in Bogd Khan. It's a protected area in Mongolia, just north of the capital. It's the old Khan's hunting ground and said to be actually the first area set aside for hunting and preservation of nature, long before Yellowstone National Park was created, for example. Each year there's a big ceremony led by shaman and Buddhist monks that have been persecuted during the communist era in Mongolia. But I've come back to honor the mountain, and these traditions are celebrated in the park every year. The rangers and the shamans and the monks, they work together to bring offerings to the mountain for prosperity of the park, of all the animals and the life in it, and then under the eternal blue sky, as this is a spiritual connection that people have in Mongolia. Yeah, these places are often seen as the world's oldest protected areas, and it's a strong way of communicating their value for nature conservation as well. So in 2008, ICN produced a booklet on how sacred natural sites could be better included in the management of protected areas and in the decision making. And then we were challenged by coming up with a definition of what is a sacred site. And I'm sure that, you know, from the past few days and your own fieldwork, you've seen that it's very difficult to define these places, that it really doesn't do justice to come up with an overarching definition, because you're including and excluding as you define things. So we had to come up with a definition that would be very open, and that's what you see here. Areas of land and water having special spiritual significance to people and communities. And that definition has sort of resonated since then throughout conservation literature. Yeah, we also see, like here, for example, at Holy Island, the nature saint, Saint Cuthbert, in the UK, that these ancient values of doing pilgrimage and suffering up on a long walk on the tidal flats up to the monastery, that these places and these traditions with these places really help preserve the religious values in place, and that they are an addition to the landscape that wouldn't be there. You know, wouldn't these traditions be continued? And it means that for the management of the protected area, this pilgrimage, for example, needs to be taken into account. It needs to be organized and facilitated. It also means lots more visitors. And this idea that Saint Cuthbert, as a nature saint, also had close connections with nature in terms of communicating with animals and proclaiming the right relationship to land, for example, that these are values that are promoted through this area, which is also a protected area. So they actually, in this sense, embody a ritual dimension in this human relationship through pilgrimage. And if you would say that to any modern person, like, what kind of ritual dimension do you embody in your life? Yeah, they wouldn't know until you ask them, so why did you walk barefoot to the monastery of Saint Cuthbert, right? And then you can start a conversation. It's often that people need to be a little bit remembered, and we speak different languages about the things we do. Okay, we're now in the Himalayas high altitude lakes. Many of these lakes are sacred. They contain relatively little animal life, maybe some small fish in places. But in these places, there are gatherings of pilgrims. This is the Bidni Kund lake. And yeah, this sits above 5,000 meters. A helicopter can barely fly there, but actually rich people nowadays do fly in for the ceremony. Yeah, these places are in an extremely vulnerable high mountain ecosystem, and whereas they in the past they might have attracted a few people for a religious ceremony, they now attract higher and higher numbers of tourists. And I have other photos which I received from the author of this particular article that show the place, even surrounding. There have been buildings of temples that are huge, landing platforms for helicopters, and huge amounts of trash that now has to be dealt with. Yeah, you can see here the Nanda Devi Raj Yatra. A yatra is the in India is the word for pilgrimage. Millions of people go on foot to eventually come up and show up at a holy ceremony in this place. It's a high altitude lake. Um, a little detour to Ghana, where sacred groves, often rather small, like you see on the picture here, are seen as the homes of the ancestors. They together, all these dots of forest around the landscape actually form a network, which is fantastic for many monkey species. The Mona monkey, true Mona monkey, which is a endemic species in this location, actually thrives on these sacred groves. But at the same time, these groves are very vulnerable to fragmentation by encroaching agriculture. And it's just because these are the homes of the ancestors that they are still there. Otherwise, they might have just disappeared. The people who take care of them are called Tindana, they're the spiritual leaders. They liaise with the king and the queen in the village, the king and the Pogna, to talk about the spiritual well-being of everybody in the village. And ceremonies are done in the sacred groves, guided by this Tindana, this spiritual leader. There's also the person who can collect medicinal herbs from these places. The idea is that you communicate with your ancestors, that they guide you in taking the right decisions and the way forward. And in Ghanese culture, this is a normal thing to look back for guidance in order to go forward. Yes, that is me. This is one of the places that is very dear to myself, close to my home across the road. Some ancient oak trees up to 600 years old, once planted to keep the sandy the sandy heathlands from turning into a dune area. These trees have seen through the ages. There's been an art history school in the Netherlands. Their work is now on display in Amsterdam in the National Museum, the Rijksmuseum. But these trees also attract people that come here to do ceremony. You might say New Ages, but they are iconic. They keep popping up. They pop up in interviews on televisions. People have stories about these trees, and all of these stories they have a dimension that touches on the spiritual, that touches on our core of our existence of who we really are in this world. And so I'm exploring the meaning of these trees a little bit from the perspective of how I look at sacred places. Interesting bit of work that I'm able to do now that I'm have a stationary life. Okay, we have a few more, and then we'll come more into the theory and talk of the day. But here we're looking at Nilda Atta Gorge Complex. This is in Kyrgyzstan. This gorge is a huge gorge. It's one of the larger complexes of sacred sites in the country. One would say they're all around the country, and yes, they are. There's this lady, Gulnara Aitpeva, has been doing inventories of sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan for a long time. It's a little bit the Vikintas of Kyrgyzstan, I think, like documenting very, very well where all the places are, making the maps, talking to the people. And the Gorge complex is one of those complexes which see highlighted in her books. And this is where sacred wells are very important, a connection with water, where people come to tell, come to ask for a good future and come to tell their future. Yeah. Another one is Isikol Lake, and it's a big, big lake surrounded by sacred sites. And that's also a UNESCO site, and that site now in the UNESCO management now takes these sacred places into account thanks to the work of Gulnara and her colleagues, obviously. In the Philippines, this is on Coron Island. Local people manage their fisheries in accordance with a giant octopus that lives in these waters. And this giant octopus basically is respected, venerated even. But its occurrence in particular places during particular times of the year sets the boundaries for when and where people can fish. And these decisions are also made by specific people in the communities who can communicate with this octopus. No one's ever seen this octopus, that's the interesting thing, but everybody is certain that the octopus exists. Here we are in Bali. There's a subak system for growing rice and irrigating rice fields. They're like probably anyone who's been to Bali or has known anyone who's been to Bali has seen photos of these type of temples of the Trihita Karana philosophy. And this promotes a balanced relationship between the realms of spirit and the human world, nature. And the authors who worked on this case study were basically interested in reviving and preserving the ritual side of this Trihata Karana system. And it's an interesting development because rice production is growing more interesting or more important. Tourism is growing more important. Everybody is somehow mysteriously interested in the spiritual element in the Balinese landscape. But the forces that are at play that govern the Balinese people's ability to do this ceremony are constantly becoming, tightening them. The opportunities for them to do ceremony are becoming less and less. They're forced to produce more rice. They're working in the tourism industry. There's less time to do ceremony. I've even heard stories of people who have eventually sold their house because people want to buy these places to start shops and to, well, outside investors are taking over, right? You sell your house, you make a lot of money. And with that lot of money, you can do a lot of ceremony until your money is finished. Then what? Problems like that, where a spiritual dimension in your life is so natural and important, but you're not sure how to survive in this world of commodification. And this is the last place I wanted to take you to, up in the high altitude of the Cordillera Vilcanota in Peru. John Reinhardt, who's been a gifted mountaineer, took this photo in 2009, and it's a ceremony led by a Catholic priest. It's actually a sacred place to the people who live in this area. But here they are they're saying goodbye to their sacred place because the glacier is disappearing. They've seen it melt, and they're saying goodbye to this sacred place. They're looking for new places. It's a transformation, a cultural transformation that is taking place. But it's also about the relationship that people have to these places, that also sacred places can disappear and can be remade elsewhere. Okay, let's take a look at how and to whom nature is sacred. And I'm going to put up a disclaimer here because obviously nature can be sacred to anyone, as long as you have that experience of sacredness. And what that then is a personal aspect. But from a perspective of conservation, it helps to somehow see things in a way that they become manageable, I guess. So we're looking at faith groups, indigenous people who are clearly distinct, often clearly distinct from each other, but not necessarily so. And we're looking at the public. So basically from indigenous people to mainstream faiths and maybe new age spiritualists or people that have a refound a spiritual connection with nature. Nature's always really inspired that sense of awe in very different ways. So we're going to look at these three different groups, and I'm going to start with indigenous people. And we know now that indigenous people, they steward about 30% of the entire surface of the globe. There's been this, you can see the article at the bottom, Stephen Garnett, who's at Charles Darwin University in Darwin, Northern Australia, did a spatial overview, the first global assessment of indigenous lands in 2018. Yeah, and then I myself also worked on a book that looked at indigenous perspectives on sacred sites, which is really interesting because I was the only non-indigenous person on the book invited to give a perspective on conservation. So I was very honored to do that. But this 30% is a huge number, obviously. And it also so happens to be the number that was set under the Convention of Biological Diversity in its global biodiversity framework that is running up until 2030 to preserve 30% of the Earth's surface by 2030 under the target 3, actually. So that is 3 is the magic number for the conservationist until 2030. Then one might conclude, okay, if indigenous people are already stewarding these 30%, why don't we just finance them to do it better? And this is where the international politics come into play under the Convention of Biological Diversity. Especially Europe was not in favor of that development. They wanted to rather see more development of protected areas or conserved areas that are more on the classical model rather than on an innovative approach where indigenous people would use their own cultures to do conservation. And then I just wanted to point out, I mean, you see that indigenous people only make up a small part of our population globally. The 80% figure here, and I should have adjusted this, and maybe you've seen this in the literature over the past half year. But there's been a publication that has looked at where that 80% figure comes from, and it doesn't exist. People like to communicate this, and I'm guilty as charged as well. I've also used this figure, and I've based it on a World Bank study from 2007. But when you go into that study, eventually you end up finding a few references that lead back to publications that are very specific about tribes in the Philippines in one occasion that were able to protect 80% of their biodiversity. And even that analysis was questionable. And that has somehow been extrapolated to a global figure on the value of biodiversity, the percentage of biodiversity that indigenous people then protect globally. So this 80% really has been a myth. But we don't know then how much of biodiversity indigenous people do protect on this 30% of the globe's surface, which makes it an interesting challenge, obviously, for transdisciplinary research among different scientists and indigenous groups to figure out, what they're actually protecting. And the interesting thing is that I've just received funding for a research project that's going to look, one of its objectives is to look into that a little bit more. Okay, faith groups, 7% of the Earth's surface, quite small in comparison to the indigenously stewarded areas, but this is actually also owned by the mainstream faiths. So you may see in Lithuania or countries like Romania where the church owns or has owned like large tracts of land, and it may not be so strange to see a figure like this. But this is the global estimate. It's done by Martin Palmer. Yeah, Palmer and O'Brien, actually, looking at the Atlas of Religion, of mapping contemporary challenges and beliefs. The old book, which I hope Martin will at some point redo, because it's a valuable resource. Here, the strength with religions lays in that like 80% of the world is religious. So if you can get the Pope to issue a new Laudato Si and talk about how important the world is and nature is to us, then this will have an impact, right? And it's going to be more impactful if people act on it. That's always the second thing. But yeah, so the values and faiths, the values and ethics that are inscribed in faiths, they basically can be an important vehicle for leveraging also conservation. And looking at sacred places, these are the ultimate places to do that, right? Something interesting here with the public is how new places become sacred. And how they can be made sacred by people who are looking for this connection to nature and to celebrate this connection to nature, where these relational values, if you will, have a spiritual identity and where they can be celebrated. And this is a phenomena that happens all across our modern societies, but also, maybe looks a little bit like indigenous ritualizing of nature. The difference being that the culture is not necessarily animistic as it is with most indigenous people. But it's an interesting phenomena that is, and I realized on the Netherlands National Ranger Day, where I gave a workshop together with Katrien de Pater, who was in your seminar last time. We gave this workshop on spirituality and conservation, and most of the managers, the conservation managers there, had examples of how these new groups of users were actually putting their footprint on their conservation areas, like adorning trees with stone drawings on the ground, by doing ceremonies, leaving candles, all sorts of things, really. So these are the books I made. There's another one that it basically doesn't fit the series, but they all have a message. They say, okay, these sacred natural sites are the world's oldest conservation areas because they contain often high levels of biological and cultural diversity that's basically gone together. We're talking about the relational values. These places, they exist inside conservation areas, but also outside conservation areas. So sometimes even outside the conservation areas hold more biodiversity than inside. And there's also some studies by Fabrizio Frascaroli, based on Italian sacred sites, that talk about this particular phenomena. But the idea is that they form in themselves conservation areas, even though there is no legal recognition or protection. And they maintain dynamic but also vulnerable sociocultural fabric in the face of these global changes. The people who look after these places, they are part of cultures that also transform and change over time. So it's not seldom that we've seen caretakers struggle or just disappear, and the places disappear with them. So they formed this primary conservation network that has largely gone unrecognized, and it's been part of my personal mission, I guess, is to alert conservationists to this. And many questions are still there about those places and what they mean to conservation. And there's obviously they've been unrecognized, so little money's gone to them. But once we can see their value and better understand them, hopefully can also vehicleize a little bit of the funding that's needed there. I'm gonna go and show you a few more thoughts that I have here, and I'm realizing we're coming up towards the end of the talk, right? So can I have some 5 more minutes for me to close?
Less discussions.
Okay.
Please, guys.
Yeah. All right, then I'll do. So this is the 2008 volume, released first in English. It's ICN most translated booklet. For some reason, it's a way for conservation agencies and ministries to show that they're doing something that relates to culture and spirituality. And I think that's one of the reasons that they were keen to, put some small budget of a few thousand euros, usually 5,000 euros, enough to 5 to 10,000 is enough to do a translation and publish the booklet. There's Russian. Estonia's got their own version of this booklet. The guidance is the same. The images change a little bit across these booklets. There's Japan, Korea. There's a French version that's gone around in Africa quite a bit, and Spanish, of course. And this booklet really contains it's a guide for protected area managers. So, anyone interested in seeing how you transform lessons learned from the field into some practical guidance, this is a really good example to look at. It contains some principles, and then here they are, the principles. But these principles all have sub principles that managers can learn from, and they can take them as a guidance. So recognizing these places, that's where you start. Then promoting the stakeholder consent, so making sure that everybody who assigns values to these places is also involved in the decision making over them, on their role in protected areas, for example. Make sure that you have all the knowledge on these places that you are allowed to have. Some knowledge will be secret, culturally inappropriate to share, but all the knowledge that is appropriate to share, that you can work with, so that you're well informed, and then protect these places in an appropriate way. Enable the caretakers of these places to do their work, basically, and do it in a way that you respect the rights of the custodians and the people that care for these places. So that booklet in itself was one thing. You produced this booklet with a team of 40 to 60 international experts. We see these drafts of the booklet going through various iterations, and then you have a product that you think you can be proud of. But then the real work starts, because protected areas managers are picking this up, they're looking at it, they're going to implement it. And I worked in Northeast Arnhem Australia, where they appended it to their cultural heritage management plan, and they took out some sections that were particularly important to them. Basically, they said, "Oh, this is really good. We've been thinking about how to formulate this in our own management planning, but you actually have done this work for us already, and we can just adapt this and write it into our cultural heritage management plan." And then, that jobs like that are usually done by the managers or a consultant who comes on. And you'll never hear that they did it, right? We write international guidance and people do things with it. So we're always keen to hear back. And in this case, I was working there myself, and people, I'd given a presentation, so they knew the booklet existed, but that they actually picked it up. I didn't need to tell them that. They did that themselves. And after that, other groups in the region did the same thing. So there's some value in there of seeing it spread. How this then works for policy guidance, I believe Estonia's worked on some policy guidance using this volume as a leverage, also to show that these sacred places are important internationally. Same's happened in Finland and in Ghana. But there are also international venues like UNESCO and the CBD, who have integrated this type of guidance under their policies. And in the CBD, they have their own set of guidelines that are basically focused on infrastructural development. So when you have large interventions on the landscape, then they have a set of guidelines called the Aquicon guidelines, meaning everything in creation in Indigenous Canadian language. And this guidance basically helps people, gives them a checklist. If you have a large intervention, then what should you pay attention to if you want to fully respect sacred places? And UNESCO has its own program on faith and sacred heritage, which is small, but yeah, slowly developing, has been developing for 15 years. You can find them on the internet as well, where they're also developing their own guidance for heritage management. And that's interesting because the 2008 guidelines have been developed together with UNESCO. The initiative came from them and ICN picked it up. So there's still some work being done. I think relatively a lot of workshops have been given in places around the world about how to implement these guidelines. I still on occasion give a workshop when I'm requested to do that. But I also really much appreciate from the field of academia, people have picked up on the idea of sacred natural sites, where like some 20 years ago, the term was new. We basically made it. And now if you do an academic literature search, you can find hundreds of publications that use that terminology and that go in depth into particular sites and case studies. I even recently reviewed a book proposal on the laws and policies of sacred natural sites that somebody, has written a whole book on the topic. And it's not my own, right? Which was kind of refreshing to see. So this applied research that's happening can be extremely valuable. For some time, we've tried to capture all of that work on a website, and this is where you can take a look. Now, I could talk a lot more, but I do want to show you two more conceptual ideas that I have, and then close. When I came out of practice and came into academia to do my PhD, I started in 2013. I needed a framework that sort of allowed me to conceptualize my work around sacred sites, and maybe it's a bit it's rather complex figure to take in. But you can see here, when we are looking at nature conservation, I looked at three different aspects. The idea of ontological pluralism, different worlds and worldviews existing at the same time. The need for a rights-based approach, so agreement on how we legally approach sacred sites. And then this theory on biocultural diversity, which today I come to understand is more of a Western, as a Western dilemma, typical to our culture of thinking in separated terms. But at the time, I used these three concepts to sort of create a common ground in where we can all find ways forward to protect sacred sites and talk about dimensions of policy, management, and practice. The practice being the things that people do on the ground, the management being those aspects of it that are sort of officialized ways of care in conservation, and the policy being like the rules and regulations that guide that from the local, national to the international level. So it was a big challenge to me. And just yesterday, as I started looking at this, and I was thinking about the rights of nature, and yes, I prepared a bunch of slides on that as well, but I think better save it for some occasion. But the thought that came to mind is that, looking at the band of Mobius, when sometimes we say there are two sides to the same coin. And with the band of Mobius, what you write on one side turns up on the other side, which is the same side, really. So I've often said, okay, I'm really interested in looking at values, worldviews, and knowledges, the things that people on the ground do, what ties them to the land. And I think it's more important than really the rights we assign to practices or people, or the responsibilities or the law, because that's quite an abstract thing. But really, I came to see these things more as intertwined. And yeah, maybe this is also the strength of relational values theory. But they go hand in hand. Yeah. And this is actually, I think, also given the time where I best leave the talk.
The main approach which you are looking at sacred places is nature, but cultural heritage, complex heritage, and special sacred national parks exist too. So what is your perspective how to interact these different legal frameworks protecting sacred places?
Yes, that's a good point. And especially, I think the idea is when you're looking at the places and you're looking at the policy frameworks and the protective regimes that are in place, you do an analysis of what is there and you look at whatever you can find to help the protection. And in this case, like my focus is area-based conservation, but I realize that the intangible heritage is just as important. And also how the the practices of care and culture are tied up with this place, and they need a different type of care. So, to my mind, it's one thing to protect a physical place, so people can continue caring and attaching and conserving that immaterial heritage and the practices that come with it. But this is the thing, I think, where we bump into where people have their responsibilities with the natural heritage. Often people are looking after plants and animals, right? And it becomes a bit different when they are looking after stories of a sacred place or rituals. And I mean, it's not always so, but I have seen that a lot, where the managers are not even from the place, and so they have to come to a place, and they have like a Western-based ecological or wildlife education, and they're not tuned in to how local people care for this place. So this is where you basically I see this different ways of knowing and valuing different expertises that are not attuned, right? So there to me is a big challenge. I think, like, if there is a community of practice where this is very obvious, I think it's UNESCO. Like I've been working with them on the World Heritage Convention on a project called what's the thing called? Connecting Practice. It was meant to connect practices between cultural heritage sites and natural heritage sites. And yes, there are mixed heritage sites in their designations as well. And that means that, the 10 criteria they have, and then some are natural, some are cultural, and some are seen as a bridging. So if you nominate mixed, you have some natural, some cultural criteria. But the way that this idea of heritage conservation was done was really from, okay, is it a natural heritage site or is it a cultural heritage site? And then if it's a natural heritage site, IUCN would be responsible and send in ecologists, conservationists, people with a perspective, with a different disciplinary background than when it would be a cultural site. And then ICOMOS would send in their cultural experts. Sometimes on the mixed sides, experts from both directions were sent, but they were always sent at different times and they didn't talk together. And obviously, everybody who nowadays goes and visit the World Heritage Sites understand that all these values are integrated and that it's a bit old-fashioned, to say the least, I guess, to go about it in such a segmented approach. So the Connecting Practice project was basically developed by ICOMOS and ICN as advisory bodies to the World Heritage Convention to look at how they could do things differently without rewriting the convention and without messing with the operational manual too much. And then, so I guess part of my question or the answer to your question that comes out of this story is we're probably stuck with some institutional approaches and definitions, and we have to find out how to bridge this. Sometimes we have to break walls, we have to meet on that common ground in between. And when we meet and we listen to one another, we have meaningful dialogues, we're able to do things differently. This is in my view, I guess, how we can progress.
So thank you. I myself am advocate for complex values and multidisciplinarity on this research and protection and management, especially because that inclusive part of all these practices is very, very modern. I can say that it is our future. And this rise of indigenous people and local people very recently only recognized for global perspective. 20 years is very small amount of years. So I would like to pass maybe to our auditorium to ask questions, please.
Thank you. Yes, 20 years is a really small period of time. Huh? Yeah, when you think about it.
Uh, can you hear me? Yeah, Bas.
Hello, yes, loud and clear.
Hello.
No crackling voice.
Thank you for your presentation, which opens to us such world perspective of sacred natural sites. But there is only communities, like religious communities, like indigenous people communities, and public in general. But I'm wondering about the role of just individual, about perhaps single family or just a man, a person who is very worried about conservation of particular um, sacred site, and especially about technology developing countries, yeah, where no indigenous communities left anymore. But how do you think about the role of very individual person? What can he do or she do? What would be the role in such huge and complex and very difficult no, uh, contexts, modern law, politics, economy, and etc., etc.?
Yeah. Thank you, Vikintas. I understand your question, and my take on this is, as an individual in a modern society, what can be your role in relation to nature and to the sacred dimension of life, really. And I see these two pathways, as into how modern people, and I think it was Latour who said, have we ever been modern, really? But we still need to connect. We still need to build a relationship with our environment. I think it was Lithuania last year, right? Forest therapy um, conference.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we have conference of forest therapy, and Lithuania recognized like intangible heritage connection between forest and nation or human
Yeah.
recently, year before.
Yeah, beautiful. Because I think like a sacred place maybe sounds a little bit like it's something separate and very special that is not accessible to anyone, just a random given individual. But in fact, it's a way that we relate to nature that makes this place and-spirited, that gives it that that spiritual dimension, that relationship carries that importance. And I can see like through developments like the becoming more popular of forest spirituality, through forest therapy, for example, is one of those movements where you see that people in our societies are looking for these connections. And I think maybe this is also something that not everything happened over the past 20 years, okay, but um, this is a time that I was building my career. So I'm looking at this time span, and I see that 20 years ago, tree hugging was considered to be tree hugging, and now you can say that you hug the tree, and that's fine, right? We do these things; it's not a problem, and it's also fine if you walk in nature without your dog, and if you sit there on your favorite spot for half an hour to meditate. It's no longer so strange. So this um, this opening up of like, becoming more socialized or cultured behavior to build a relationship with nature, um, I think really helps, and it helps in a way that it allows also, and this is also in the work with Katrien de Pater, where we studied for spirituality. It came to the fore that, for example, there are more and more small companies that are looking at taking people into nature to do meditation, to do walking coaching, to learn how to use a sit spot in nature or how to ritualize their own place in nature as a place that they can care for, so the place cares for them. So building a sacred relationship with nature. But this is something that's one development I'm seeing, and what it means for the sort of political aspect. Yeah, what I mean, it can have a political dimension, very much so, right? We're like in the Netherlands, for example, the current government is doing little to nothing in terms of nature conservation. We have huge problems with nitrogen deposition. We all know it's a few large industrial emitters that are not going to go away, and we know it's the agricultural dairy sector. We're the second largest in the world. We're producing crazy amount of nitrogen, but the farmers just won't want to stop. And and these kind of problems, they are political problems. But if we don't show that we are related to nature, that the decline of species that happens in our country every day, the decline of ecosystems and the quality of our environment matters to us, then the politics are also not going to change. And so we see shifting narratives of why nature is important in our society. We see more and more that people are saying, we want this safe environment. We love the trees. We love these landscapes. These are the places that, and here come all the value alignments, right? They are not just arguments of rationality, of okay, they clean our water or they give us the fresh air, but these are the places that people love, that people relate to, and that's important. Yeah. So this whole idea of therapy, nature connectedness, but also being able to value it from deeply within and build a new relationship. I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Bas. Do anybody want to proceed to ask question? If no one, I would like to ask again, if you allow to me. Yes, I can agree very much with you that all these formats, how to safeguard our nature is important. And this spirituality term is very good for that, because when we speaking about our connection with nature, it's very much personal. And this term spirituality or religious, it gets to the level upper. And in Lithuania, we still have very much relations with nature. A lot of traditions connected with gathering of mushroom berries in the forests, speaking with trees and protecting them as our neighbors or our family members. And even these traditions are not, some of them are very old and some of them are quite new. For example, the speaking mushrooms, berries in the forest is very ancient traditions, but myself, for example, I have some new traditions started in city when people who looks after and visiting or coming to old oaks, they started new community. And these oaks which are not protected, like natural objects or individual, they started to be protected by stories. Because
Nice.
we are telling stories, what we are doing, why these oaks, for example, are important to us, give them names, and they are not the object of nature conservation, but they started to be personalities.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
So thank you, Bas. I think we would like to speak a little bit in Lithuanian about the topic,
Yeah.
if you agree.
I'm very happy for you to do that, obviously. Would you like me to sign off or in
You can stay, but we would like to proceed in Lithuanian. And thank you again.
Okay.
One more.
Well, thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure to be able to give you this presentation, and I really appreciate the discussion as well. And yeah, good luck with the final day of the symposium. I've used Google Translate to look at what is in your symposium, and I realized that tackling the topic of spirituality from so many different angles, that is really, really super interesting. So yeah, I'm one thing. If one thing I can say is I encourage you to like get any of the valuable research you're doing or the talks out in English as well. And I'm sure there's people that would be really, really keen on reading and seeing that. Yeah.
Thank you. It was a big pleasure to be with you and to deepen more in the world context, which I have big wisdom for us. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for all the good work you do. All right. Goodbye now.
Na ir aš norėčiau dar, kad mes šiek tiek lietuviškai pagalvotume apie tai, ką vat išgirdom, arba aš galėčiau šiek tiek referuoti tas rekomendacijas, kurias Pasaulio gamtos išsaugojimo sąjunga pateikė, saugant būtent sakrales vietovės. Ir iš tikrųjų tos rekomendacijos vertos būti išverstos į lietuvių kalbą, jeigu tai pavyktų kažkokiu būdu. nes vis dėlto IUCN yra rimta organizacija ir kurios rekomendacijas paprastai mūsų teisės aktai atsižvelgia. Na, bent jau mes galim pakelti ranką, kad atsižvelgtų labiau. Kas tose rekomendacijose mane labiausiai iš tikrųjų taip palietė, kad yra labai detaliai paaiškinta, kaip reikėtų sakysim, ištirti tas vietovės ir ką svarbu nustatyti. Tai tiesiog tose gairėse yra, pavyzdžiui, tokie, įsivaizduokite, ką reikia apžiūrėti. Vien žodžiu, sakykime, kokius kriterijus apžiūrėti, kad turėtų būti ta vadinama prigimtinė vertė, pavyzdžiui, sveikatos ir sveikatinimo vertė, rekreacijos, turizmo, laukiniškumo pojūčio, pavyzdžiui, vertė, tada, sakykime, taip, mokomoji vertė, mokslo ir edukacinė, įskaitant ir tradicinės žinias, kurias žmonės žino apie tą vietą, tada vietos dvasia, kaip po toksai aspektas, estetinė vertė ir estetinės vertybės, tada eina ta dvasinė vertė ir inspiracijos galios gali būti iš tos vietos kylančios, piligrimystės ir lankymo visi klausimai, taikos, ramybės klausimas ir galimybė patirti tylą. Ir taip pat meninės vertės ir inspiracijos. Tai va čia pasakiau jums tik tai labai mažą dalelę už to išvardinimo, iš ko susideda vietos vertė. Ir man atrodo, kad tikrai mums yra daug apie ką pagalvoti ir labai didelis plotis tų, sakykime, religinių, bet gal aš sakyčiau dvasinių aspektų vertingų teritorijų, vietų, ateities dar tyrimų. Gal norite jūs kas pasakyti savo perspektyvas, mintis, tai labai kviesčiau.
Taip, Giedrė priminė tą tokią pasaulinę, sakykime, praktiką ir tai, kaip, ne visose šalyse, bet daugelį yra, o kas Lietuvoje geriausiai gali apsaugoti, nors irgi su daugybė problemų, tai tik tai gamtinė vertė, tik tai. Pradėk kalbėti apie kokią kultūrinę, dvasinę, apie vietos dvasę, ar apie meninę vertę, ten apie tylą pamiršk ir dar nepriėjom prie to. Tai jeigu toj vietoje yra kažkokių indikatorinių ten rūšių, ar raudonosios knygos, ar lizdas, nors ir jis ne viską apsaugo, tai dar kažkokia yra viltis. O jeigu to nėra, tai tiesiog rankos nusvyra ir tiesiog nėra ką daryti. Ir tas yra liūdniausia, kad tokiam neinstituciniam lygmenį, tokiam visuomenės lygmenį, šito pas mus labai trūksta, labai stokojama. Ne? Tų tokių žmonių, kurie ir prisimtų atsakomybę, kai kuriais atvejais juk ir yra privačioj žemėje, net ir nereikia to valstybės įsikišimo. Ne? Netgi galėtų, taip sakant, viskas vykti be kažkokio tai tenai reikalavimų ar įsiterpimų, tarpininkavimų, bet nevyksta. O kai pradedi su valstybinėm institucijom ir kalbant konkrečiai apie šventvietės, kur aš jau dabar 30 metų ir taip sakant, praėjęs viską nuo pradžios, tai aš suprantu, toks labai yra gilus, įsisenėjęs toksai įsivaizdavimas. Šventvietė žvelgiama per tokį krikščionišką požiūrį, per akinius ir tas toksai architektūrinis suvokimas, ne, per statinius, per koplyčias, per kryžius, jis labai neleidžia prieiti prie to gamtinių tų, sakykime, tokių dalykų, kurie labiau, daugiau būnantiem, keliaujantiem, jie tampa akivaizdus. Čia kaip gražiai Leonas vakar prisiminė. Ne? Aš ateinu prie Piliakalnio ir ten auga 2 ąžuolai kaip vartai. Ne? Tai niekas kitas iš valdininkų, iš miškininkų jiem nemotais tie du ąžuolai kaip vartai, ne? Ir nu, va, čia va, nu, tokios va, susidaro labai sudėtingos situacijos, bet būtų galima jų išvengti. Nu, ir tikiuosi, kad kada nors taip įvyks, bet kol kas tokia nu, tiesiog į neviltį varanti situacija.
Aš manau, kad iš tikrųjų ne veltui ir Basas sako, visame pasaulyje šventvietės yra labai smarkiai dar nesuprastos ir nepakankamai ištirtos, nepakankamai suprastos, kaip jos funkcionuoja ir kad funkcionuotų tokios, kaip yra, arba neprarastų savo sakralumo ateityje. Ir tas yra ir visame pasaulyje, ir Lietuvoje, ir tos mūsų mokslo žinios, kurios buvo koncentruotos į atskiras sritis. Čia tik tai archeologija, čia daugiau nieko nėra. Čia tik tai, pavyzdžiui, kultūros paveldas, čia daugiau nieko nėra. Senamiestyje nėra gamtos. Pavyzdžiui, aš daugybę kartų esu tą girdėjusi, kad kraštovaizdžio visiškai nėra Vilniaus senamiestyje. Tai vat, mes visi turim, kaip pasakyti, priimti va, tą, ką irgi ir Basas, ir tose tarptautinėse rekomendacijose yra labai svarbius tasai blokas, kuris sako skirtingų požiūrių integracija. Ir tai yra labai sudėtinga ekspertui, kuris gilus savo srityje, sudėtinga, pavyzdžiui, žmogui iš visuomenės suprasti, tai ko čia jie ginčijasi, ko čia galima nesutarti, bet vilties man, pavyzdžiui, suteikia toks dalykas, kaip saugomų teritorijų įstatyme dabar yra nauja savoka, kur kompleksiniai kraštovaizdžio objektai. Tai reiškia, kad tai yra vietos objektai, kuriems vietos žmonės turi vien žodžiu tam tikrų žinių apie jas ir kurios svarbios vietos žmonėms ir kurios turės kompleksinę vertę. Tai reiškia, nebūtinai turės aukščiausią vertę iš kultūros taško, tai jeigu mes vertinsim bažnyčias ir koplyčias, jų gali ten nebūti ir jos gali neturėti ypatingos gamtinės vertės. Tai reiškia, jeigu yra šaltinis, jo gal, pavyzdžiui, debitas nėra toks didelis, kad jis būtų vertingas kaip hidrogeologinių, sakysim, aspektų. Bet toks objektas, tokia vietovė atranda dabar galimybę būti saugomams, tačiau nėra kriterijų, pagal kuriuos apibrėžti, ką reiškia svarbus vietos bendruomeniai, ką reiškia svarbus žmonėms. Ir institucijos šiuo metu, pavyzdžiui, neturi įrankių, kaip įgyvendinti šitą nuostatą. Tai aš kalbėjausi, pavyzdžiui, su anykščiais, kurie niekaip neapsaugo savo tuopų, medžių, aliejų prie kelių, kurios būtent turi tokias abi vertes, bet nepakankamas nei gamtai, nei kultūrai. Sako, mūsų netvirtins, bet sakau, jūs bandykite, nes tokiu būdu tik tai galėsime gauti tuos kriterijus. Tai reiškia, kad aš visus jūs kviečiu siūlyti, pavyzdžiui, saugomų teritorijų tarnybai skelbti kompleksiniais, tai yra kraštovaizdžio saugomais objektais vietos, kurios turi įvairiopas vertes tam tikroje vietoje. Gal kiti dar norėtų, prašau. Žymant.
Aš tai už Vykinto pastebėjimo kažkaip užsikabinau ir man norisi gal šiek tiek sureaguoti ir gal šiek tiek provokuojančiai. Aš girdžiu iš Vykinto tokį nusivylimą.
Ilgas darbas buvo.
Aš girdžiu tokį nusivylimą, žinai, kad nepavyksta, neveikia. Reiškia, tik tai gamtiniai objektai, galima už jų pasislėpti, reiškia, kurie yra įtvirtinti ir įpareigoti ten direktyvomis ar dar kažką ir tada, o kiti, ir ypatingai Vykintas užsiminė taip pat, kai ir privačiame lygmenyje, kai apie su žmonėm kalbėjai, tos motyvacijos iš jų nėra. Ir man tai čia yra labai didelis paradoksas, nes jeigu mes pasižiūrėtume plačiai Lietuvos visuomenę, judėjimas prieš miškų kirtimą ir saugojimas miškų, mes čia ošiam kaip giria, visa visuomenė, visi kalbam, visos apklausos visuomeniai rodo, ohoho, reiškia, kokį nebejingumą šitiems dalykams atrodytų. Ir čia aš girdžiu Vykinto tokią pastebėjimą ir tokią neviltį, brūkšnelis viltį galbūt į ateitį. Ir man tai primena situaciją, vieno kaimo bendruomenės istoriją, kuomet bendruomenė buvo labai pasipiktinusi aplink kertamais miškais, kaltino valdžią ir kaip čia viskas yra, žodžiu, blogai. Ir aš tada paėmiau, pasistengiau pasigilinti, o tai ką ten iš tikrųjų kerta. Ir pabandyti pažiūrėti, kiek iš to kertamo miško yra privačios nuosavybės, tai reiškia tos pačios bendruomenės narių, tik individų. Ir kiek yra to valstybinio miško, dėl ko mes kaltinam čia valdžią. Ir paaiškėjo, aš dabar neatsiminsiu tikslių procentų, bet man atrodo, tų privačių kirtimų buvo apie 80%. Reiškia, tai, kai tai nebėra individo, kai tai yra kažkokio tai jau didesnio sociumo, tai mes visi mušamės į krūtinę ir kovojam, bet kai tai nusileidžia į tavo individualų lygmenį, tada ir čia aš tiesiog galvoju, gal čia gal ne informatumo klausimas, bet gal čia yra tas fenomenas, kurį mes dažnai vadiname krepšinio, būti krepšinio teisėjų, sėdint ant sofos ir graužiant popkornus arba sėdint Facebook'e ir komentuojant specialistų, reiškia, bet pačiam nepajudinant užpakalio kažką tai padaryti. Čia toksai, visuomenės impotentiškumas gal šiek tiek. Tai, nežinau, tiesiog keliu tokį klausimą, nes man nesueina galai. Kaip tokioje visuomenėje, reiškia, mes esame abejingi dalykams, kurie...
Gal čia susirinkinė tokia, aš galvoju. Pirma mintis, kuri man ateina į galvą, dar kas nors gal norėtų irgi pasisakyti, gal savo nuostatas išsakyti arba viltis. Aš tai dar prašom Dainiau.
Aš truputį pasivokai, bet nieks nesiveržia, tai priejau. Jau ne pirmą kartą man aš panašiuose klausimuose girdžiu visai ne žmogaus santykį su gamta, o grinai dvasinį klausimą, tai žmogaus santykį ir su žmogum, ir apskritai žmogaus santykį. Ir pasakysiu tokį palyginimą, irgi ne pirmą kartą. Įsivaizduokite, žmogus šiaip tą gamtą tvarko, valdo, jis tarsi, kaip lyg tėvas, toks galingas tėvas, reiškia kažką tokio turi, su kuo jis turi skirtingą santykį. Palyginsiu su tėvu turinčiu dukrą. Vienas tėvas tą dukrą, nori net dukrelės, augina, jis ieško mokytojų, gerų ten sveikatą rūpinasi, jis yra toks santykis nukreiptas į viltį, į auginimą, į meilę, mes tai pavadinkim. O kitas santykis yra, jis tą dukrą pažiūri, biški paaugo ir parduoda į viešnamį. Mes apie tai kalbam, kad tai, kas yra vienam mylima, kitas parduoda į viešnamį, nes parduoti ir yra į viešnamį, tai yra paversti pinigais, keičiama valiuta, reiškia viskas paverčiama keičiama valiuta, mes savo tėvynę, savo kalbą, beje, ne pirmus dešimtmečius, šimtmečius mes ją keičiame valiutą paverčiam, savo tapatybę, savo tautybę, galima sakyti, kad aš vėl tame matau, lygą mes sergam ir tai ta pati lyga yra. Dėl to gamta čia aplinka iškyla tik kaip vienas, sakyčiau, gal net ne pirmailis atvejis šitos lygos. Šitos iliuzijos, kad šitą mažai nesvarbų dalyką aš iškeisiu, paversiu keičiamą valiutą, o už tą keičiamą valiutą, o kas tada su ją? Kažkur Ispanijoje ar kažkur, ar ne? Ką daryti su tais pinigais? Bet iki šiol yra viskas matuojama ta praduodamąją vertę. Kiek mes galim to BVP ar kažkokio BBP ar dar kažkokio, čia tos santrumpas juokingas. Atsiprašau.
Ačiū, prašom. Po to Monika.
Aš turiu vieną klausimą ir vieną refleksiją. Tai mano klausimas apie edukaciją miškininkų. Kodėl yra tas diskursas, kad reikia mišką tvarkyti, kirsti, jeigu ne, jisai netvarkingas. Ir po to žmonės taip pat sako, čia miškininkas sakė, tai nėra tokio supratimo, kad miškas pats gali tvarkytis. Ir viena refleksija, tai aš buvau Jungtinių tautų klimato konferencijai ir kaip tokią audiovizualinę intervenciją daviau dalyviam ten iPadą su citatomis mūsų buvusio ministro. Tai jiem visiems buvo labai juokinga ir man kolegos iš ten Ruandos ir Šrilankos sakė ir buvo labai nustebę, kad pas jūs čia kaip pas mus, mes galvom, kad jūs Europą labai išsivyščiusi ir labai aukšto lygio, tai jam buvo šokas. Tai man buvo labai įdomu suprasti, kad Lietuva tokia, mes tarp vakarų, rytų ir pietų ir nėra tokios stiprios atvaros.
Ačiū. Monika, prašom.
Sveiki. Tai savo tokias gal dvi temas yra reflektuojant užsimezgė, tai viena reflektuojant į Vykinto pasidalinimą, kad lik nėra tų asmeninių iniciatyvų ir negamtinių pagrindų pagristų, tai aš atvirkščiai matau tokią situaciją, kad jų yra ir nemažai, bet tada yra atsidurama į, kad ir pavyzdys Vilkaviškio rajone šeima turi daug supirkę žemę ir nori suteikti specialų statusą ir jie labiau gal kultūrinių pagrindų ir vertybinio ar dvasinių pagrindų nori sukurti tokią erdvę, bet atsiduria į mūsų biurokratinės institucinės taisyklės, kurios sako, atvažiavom, neradom čia gamtinės vertybės, kad pagrįstumėm, kad čia būtų suteikti specialų statusą. Tai ir nebelieka tada žmonėm, jie taip pasimeta, kad yra, va čia kol nėra, netgi teisė sukurti erdvę, kad atsirastų, nėra. Tai aš Lietuvoje iš tiesų pasigendu ir čia buvo paminėta tas vertybių pagrindas, kuris remiasi The Rights of Nature. Ir jis šiaip Skandinavijoje dabar labai populiarus, būtent ir Lenkijoje net renkami ir moksliniai parašai ir bendruomenės dėl gamtos teisės kaip į gyvą būtybę. Tai Lietuvoje aš va šito diskurso pasigendu ir tarp intelektualų, ir tarp mokslininkų apie tą pačią nerį kalbant iš šitos perspektyvos. O dar kitas, kalbant apie religinės bendruomenės, tai kai dabar turim Rovumą paskeltą religinę bendruomenę, galva su tom šventvietėm ir šventaisiais miškais, nebūtinai miškais tam tikrom vietovėm galėtų atsirasti tokių precedentų. Žinau, kad yra nemažai teisininkų Lietuvoje, kurie ilgą laiką laukia, kada turėsim tokį precedentą, kad Romuva jau turi šitą statusą ir jie tada sako, kadangi visam pasaulyje yra daug precedentų, to pagrindo apgintos tam tikros erdvės. Bet tada šituo keliu būtų labai lengva turėti Lietuvoje praeitų kelių. Tai keletą tokių pavyzdžių. Netgi dėl ąžuolų skambina žmonės ar dėl medžių savo teritorijai ir konsultuojasi, kad jie nori juos padaryti, suteikti jiem kažkokį statusą, tada ten paviešinti, kviesti žmonės, nori oficialaus valstybės pripažinimo ir tada atsiduria netgi tas pačias saugomas teritorijos, kurios, nėra aukščio. Trūksta aukščio. Tai aš labiau matau, kad iš žmonių yra, bet nėra, institutalizacija kaip ir neleidžia išsiplėsti plačiau.
Ačiū, Monika. Aš šiek tiek, žiūrėkit, iš karto dvi atsirado. Aš tik truputį noriu sureaguoti, kadangi mes neturime čia tų institucijų, bet aš noriu pasakyti, kad tos institucijos nėra guminės ir negali rūpintis daugybiniais objektais, tiesiog nesirūpina jau tais, kurie yra, neapsaugo tų saugomų teritorijų, kurios yra, todėl jos stengiasi naujų kiek įmanoma mažiau kurti, kad mes galėtume sakyti, kad jos rūpinasi tomis, kurias jau turi. Vienas iš tokių dalykų. Antras, tai manau, kad labai daug tų asmeninių iniciatyvų jos gali būti be valstybės ir jos gali būti pakankamai stiprios tam, kad tos vertybės išliktų. Tai yra nebūtina valstybės arba regiono apsauga tam, kad būtų, sakysim, ta vertybė, kai kurioms reikia, bet ne visoms. Tai aš jau dabar užtenka, mačiau kėlė ranką Indrė, taip, ir Regina vėliau.
Sveiki, mano vardas Indrė ir aš šiek tiek esu susidūrus su to medžiais ir miškais, saugojimu ir bendruomenėm, stebėjau visą šitą ir ąžuolyno Kauno, dabar stebiu vyksmą ir man susidarė toks įspūdis, kaip ir šitoje erdvėje mes dabar sėdim ir kalbam, mes kažką padarėm, nieko nenusprendėm, nesiėmėm kažkokios peticijos, neparašėm nieko, Ne, tiesiog mes kalbam, mums patinka kalbėti, išsikalbėti, savo įsiskaudinimą pareikšti, kaip Vykintas pareiškė. Reikia daryti. Tiesiog daryti. tą, ką tu gali va dabar šią akimirką padaryti, arba ką tu gali padaryti kažkur tai nuėjęs. Tai tiesiog mano toks yra požiūris. Aš darau visada. Kiek galiu, ką galiu, kartais atrodau kvailai, kartais kaip beprotė, bet kartais tai pramuša. Tai norėčiau palinkėti drąsos ir sugalvoti dabar šią akimirką, ką mes galim šią akimirką padaryti.
Na, ačiū, Indrė, už tai, kad darai, už tai, kad pasisakei. Regina, labai trumpai, nes tikriausiai visi nori kavos, jau aš irgi užtelsiu.
Trumpai, dėl to man tas laukiniškumo principas labai įdomus, jį labai sunku ir apginti. Nes prisimenu, taip trumpai ten viena botanikė Sibirė pamatė pirmą pradį mišką. Tokią emociją šilgam ten, kas per dalykai, gamtininkai tai jaučia. Bet apginti tikrai labai sunku, skaičiai. Bet va dabar, kai dainavom šitas sutartynės, taigi buvo sakralinės geometrijos principas. Tai aš nežinau, gal ir čia tas sakralumos geometrijai skaičiais kažkoks turi būti. Nu, čia vienas momentas. O kitas trumpai. Pavyzdžiui, geografija yra tokia dailės geografija. Mūsų docentė Marija Dubliauskienė, čia irgi dailininkė sėdi. Tai jinai, pavyzdžiui, tokią discipliną, studijuojant ir rašo žmonės diplominius darbus. Aš pasirinkau, paskaičiau. Ten, pagrindinis principas, į ką gamtoje atkreipia dėmesį tie, kurie tapo. Ir jeigu daug tapomas, tas, kas sutampa su saugotinų gamtinių objektų, valio, rezonuoja. Tai dabar, ką daryti? Tai plenerai šventvietėse. Nežinau, gal atrodo nerimtai, reikia pasaugot. Bet nors tokį kažkokį eksperimentuką dvaruose tapo, piliakalnius tapo, o šventvietė, dailininkė.
Na, tai čia ateities dar reikalai. Tai sakyčiau, kad grožis arba, kai skaičiau irgi tarptautinius tos dokumentus, kad dramatizmas, vietovės dramatizmas yra vienas iš dalykų, dėl kurių tos vietos tampa dvasiškai svarbios. Tai reiškia didžiulė erdvė, žmogui nepavaldus mastelis, reiškiniai, kurie yra reti ir nematyti, tos vietos, kurios nepasikartoja, yra unikalios, jos privalo turėti apsaugą. Ir mes visi kažką dėl to galim padaryti, bent jau apie tai netylėti. O ką žinom, sakyti, visus kviesti, rodyti, dalinti savo požiūriu, nes manau, kad labai svarbu dalinti savo požiūriu. Aš manau, kad ir Vykintas savo ekskursijose tą daro, ir visi kiti, ką mes kviečiam kitus žmonės, tai labai manau, kad tai vyksta. Na, tik tai kartais gali užtrukti labai daug laiko ir ne visoms šventvietėms ta laiko juosta yra tinkama, kai kurios gali prarasti savo sakralumą ir jo nebeatgauti. Tai dabar, kad atgautume energiją, kavos pertrauką ir neformalus pasikalbėjimas. Ačiū visiems.